scholarship cadet there at the Army ROTC. I'll be commissioning as a second lieutenant come May 2023 with hopes of branching infantry or combat engineer. So at this moment, I am going to share my screen and the presentation will begin. All right, perfect. All right, minimize that. All right, so beginning with Dr. Leon Bass, fighting for freedom at home and abroad. All right, so African Americans in the military. African Americans have bravely participated in every conflict in defense of the United States of America, dating back to our nation's earliest days in the Revolutionary War. However, they have done so in segregated units. By World War II, over 1 million African American men and women had served in the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. And just for some background information, the reason why I didn't display the Air Force was because at the time in World War II, the Air Force was a department of the Army, and they were titled as the Army Air Corps. And the reason why the Black men and women could not serve alongside service members who were white was because the white officers thought that the Black service members weren't on the same level as the white service members. So moving forward to Dr. Leon Bass. His family roots date back to South Carolina, dating back to the Post-Emancipation Proclamation, which was the proclamation by President Abraham Lincoln, who abolished slavery. His father, Henry Bass, also served in the United States Army in World War I, and he deployed to France. Bass's father dealt with a lot of segregation as well, which is why Bass stated in his testimony previous times that his father came back a different man and he was mistreated but in abundance of ways. So Bass, his parents, before Bass was born, they moved to Philadelphia. And Bass attended an all-Black elementary school, and that is where he learned information and witnessed firsthand accounts of healthy and respectful relationships among students and teachers. His families and neighbors were poor, just given the fact that this was the 1930s, and as we all know, the 1930s was the time of the Great Depression. However, Bass stated that life was good during those times, just for the simple fact that they were all grateful for what they had. However, the community he lived in, they suffered much, just for the simple fact that there was a lot of lynching going on, and also there was a lack of federal education funds. And of course, the Great Depression, which gave a huge economic depression to the community. So this title is titled Principles. And the reason why I came up with that title is for the simple fact that during Bass's childhood, and as I mentioned previously, his father Henry served in World War I as an Army soldier. So his father had a huge amount of patriotism instilled into him and his siblings. And I remember in the testimony, he spoke about how his father had made them pledge the national anthem every morning. And that's why on the bottom I put, if that is not true patriotism, then I don't know what is. So moving on to segregation. Pardon me. Segregation. Bass recounted a time when he visited a theater, and as a person of color, it was made clear to him that society viewed him as an outsider. And going off another incident, as he stated later on that summer, he was looking through a fence, and in the distance was a public pool, and he knew he could never enter that pool because the way society viewed him as, and they viewed him as an outsider. And this experience of segregation and othering continued during his enlistment in the United States Army after graduating high school at 18 years old in 1943. So here, thanks to Spencer at the HRC, he was so kind enough to edit these videos for me. And I was able to locate a clip in Bass's testimony when he was describing what he witnessed while enlisting. So I'm gonna play that for you right now.
Justin, we can't hear it.
You can hear it?
No, we can't hear it.
Sorry about that.
It could be because you have your headphones in.
Okay.
Happens to me all the time.
Appreciate it. All right, we'll start that again. Just want to confirm that if you guys can hear it.
No, I think you need to take your headphones out. Otherwise, it thinks that it's speaking just to you.
Oh yes, the headphones are off, by the way. But I just don't have them plugged into my ears.
Is your Bluetooth on?
You still can't hear it, correct?
Nope. Why don't you describe what he's speaking about in the clip?
Oh, of course, yeah. Right. Well, that's very unfortunate because it was a very nice clip. So Bass was describing how when he walked into the enlistment center, the recruiter that was there for the Army had a rank of a sergeant, and the sergeant had directed him and his other Black friends who walked into one side, and the white kids that they walked into to another side. And that right there was an instant segregation towards Bass and his fellow Black enlistees. And later on, later on, Bass is sent to a segregated unit, which I would talk about in a second. All right. So here is a photo that I was able to find on Google. It's not of Bass, however, it was the closest photo that could relate to the title of Segregation. So as I stated previously, a recruiter stood inside the office, and when Bass walked in with his white friends, the sergeant directed Bass one way and his white friends another way. And as you can see here, these are all African Americans enlisting, and the officers and the higher officials are all white. Okay, so racism in the Army. So Bass encountered an abundant amount of racism, both during his military training and as well as the town nearest to Camp Wheeler. After 3 to 4 months of training, Bass and his fellow Black soldiers were notified that the Army did not need infantry soldiers anymore. So when Bass enlisted, he was promised to go 11 Bravo, which is infantryman. And as a result, the Army switched his MOS, his job title, into combat engineers, which is a 12 Bravo. Bass and his fellow soldiers had to attend combat engineer training in Mississippi. And Bass stated that things became increasingly worse during the months spent at Camp McCain. So just keep in mind that all the Army facilities were located in the South. And Bass was reminded of what society viewed him as, an outsider. So Bass and his fellow Black soldiers experienced negative treatment during all of their training rotations in the segregated South. His unit, however, had no knowledge what was occurring to the Jewish community overseas in Nazi-occupied Europe. And Bass, in the testimony, he states a lot that there was no communication among the enlisted soldiers that were Black and the white officers. So Sergeant Bass would be assigned to the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion, 8th Corps U.S. 3rd Army, which served under General George Patton, and it was a segregated unit comprised of African American soldiers. Here we have a picture of Sergeant Bass. After his racial encounters as a young soldier, Bass questioned whether or not he wanted to remain in the Army. He mentioned how he was disrespected many times while being in uniform, and much of this disrespect was given by not only his officers. So this created obviously a sense of toxic leadership. And Bass also mentions how they were sometimes treated like animals. All right, so moving on to England. So Bass describes a time in England as 3 wonderful months. And in a small town where him and his fellow 183rd Battalion engineers were residing, he met the locals and he described them to be respectful and compassionate. And he mentioned also that he met a woman, and in England, he went with her family to a theater in London, and they went to go watch Hamlet. So the locals viewed Bass and the other men as soldiers who wanted to fight evil and bring more good to the world. So obviously for Sergeant Bass, this was definitely something that he was proud of, just for the simple fact that he wasn't treated this way by America's locals. So combat. Bass and his fellow engineers left to the heart of France, and later they were ordered to assist General Patton's 3rd Army Division in Belgium. Their main mission was to construct a damaged bridge. Patton was arriving with Army units because the 101st Airborne Division, which is out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, was heavily involved nearby in the Battle of Bastogne, which is one of the most horrendous battles in the entire war. The mission was simple: just get the bridge up for General Patton and the Army units, and that way they can cross over into Bastogne to go assist the 101st Airborne Division, which are also known as the Screaming Eagles. Bass and his fellow engineers successfully completed the mission. However, they experienced the worst of combat and of death. So here I was able to display a photo of the Battle of the Bulge, which is also known as the Ardennes Offense. And here, this is Bastogne right here. This is where the 101st Airborne Division was heavily operating. And this is General Patton's 3rd U.S. Army Division. And right here we have France. So Bass's mission was to construct a bridge to get over into Bastogne from France to Belgium. So this slide is extremely symbolic, just because many members of the military have their own why of why they serve or why they want to pursue a certain career field, whether it's being combat support or combat arms or being special operations. So Bass wanted to know why he was serving for a country that viewed him as an outsider. He was involved in deadly combat firefights. He was dealing with explosives because as a combat engineer, you're constantly doing route clearances, which means you're searching for roadside bombs. And all of these thoughts presented themselves to Bass and the other engineers during their darkest hours. And here I was able to find a picture of Black US soldiers saluting the flag, displaying true leadership. And one of them is smiling. All right, unfortunately, because of what happened earlier, the video.
I would try it. I would try it, Justin.
Try it again? Okay. All right, hopefully it works, because these videos are awesome. Just, it's very unfortunate. Are you all able to hear it?
No, you know what? We'll share them with everybody after the presentation. That way we'll still be able to hear them or to see them.
Understood. All right, so in this video clip that I was able to locate and Spencer was able to construct, Bass was sharing his thoughts of his why, as I mentioned the previous slide. So there was this time during the battle when they were constructing the bridge to get General Patton's 3rd Army Division into Bastogne to go assist the 101st Airborne Division. There was a wounded Black engineer soldier who received multiple gunshot wounds to the chest, and he was laying down, bleeding out, and Bass was holding him in his arms. At the same time, Bass was looking straight into his eyes, and he mentions that his eyes were pale. And he quickly thought to himself, while there's bullets flying, tracers going everywhere, he just froze and thought to himself, that could be me. And his main thought was, why? Why? But why would I put myself in that deadly situation for a country who clearly doesn't respect me because of my skin pigmentation? So that's something very symbolic and fragile. Moving on to the next slide. So I titled this as Healthy Relationships, and he was able to construct more relationships as he traveled around Europe. As I mentioned previously, he met a woman and her family in England, and the locals treated him with respect. However, in France, Bass met a young boy who actually spoke 6 languages. And during the Battle of the Bulge, Bass and the young boy became friends. However, he mentioned After the Battle of the Bulge, he never reconnected with that young boy again and never saw him as well. So in France, Bass made strong connections with people, and a lady even told Bass that she saw no difference between a white soldier and a black soldier. And she said this in front of a white officer, and Bass stated that the white officer went from smiling to a serious face quickly. And Bass stated happily that the French were all extremely welcoming, and they showed nothing but compassion to himself and all of the soldiers that were there, no matter if they were black or white, Asian or Hispanic. They all showed compassion. Okay. So this is probably one of my favorite slides. Just when I was introducing myself earlier, this is my top 2 branch choice for commissioning as an officer, the combat engineers, also known as 12 Bravo. Bass and his fellow combat engineers from the 183rd Battalion completed other tasks in Belgium, such as checking on bridges and constructing route clearances. Route clearances is a term for checking for landmines. As this photo right here from World War II, I was able to locate. And they crossed the Rhine River and helped build the bridge crossing into Frankfurt, Germany. This photo is not from Bass's 183rd unit. This is actually from the 10th Mountain Division in Fort Drum, New York. This is from their 7th BEEB unit, which is their Breacher Engineer Brigade. And here is the emblem of the Corps of Engineers. Okay, so Liberating Buchenwald concentration camp. So Bass stated that he had an impression that the German soldiers were fearless and excellent soldiers that needed to be taken seriously. During a reconnaissance mission, Bass had truly discovered what had been occurring in Nazi Germany. As I mentioned earlier, he had no idea what was going on in Nazi Germany, as many as the other soldiers didn't as well. His platoon discovered a camp, which was the Buchenwald camp. He stated that it was very difficult for me to comprehend what was going on. So liberating Buchenwald. At 20 years old, Bass learned that the people imprisoned in this camp were prosecuted and weren't good enough to Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany had these people in there going through these deadly scenes because they want them to starve to death. Bass walked around the camp and examined the barracks where he witnessed a skin and bones man on the bunks. Bass saw these deep-set eyes that he could never forget, and he mentions that later on as well during the testimony. And Bass never knew this was occurring because there was no communication with himself and the officers. He had no idea that these camps existed all over Nazi-occupied Europe. So in continuation to liberating Buchenwald, Bass witnessed the instruments of torture in the camp. Of course, this is a traumatic experience for Bass, considering he's only 20 years old. However, it would also be a traumatic experience for anyone. He was focused on how he felt because himself and his soldiers, they never spoke about what they witnessed during that liberation. He mentioned that he only spoke to Sergeant Scott, who was a photographer in his unit, and they spoke about what they witnessed, and that was the only other soldier that he had a conversation with about Buchenwald. Scott was able to capture photos of the cruelty of the camp, and he ended up giving Bass some pictures later on. Bass witnessed piles of bodies scattered everywhere, and even children's clothes. However, he never saw one child in sight. Bass also mentioned that there was no Germans inside the camp when they arrived. However, there was one Nazi soldier who was there, and he stated that he saw the survivors just stomping on him and beating him and just unleashing their emotions. So the photograph that I mentioned previously from Sergeant Scott, this was the photograph I was able to find off Google. However, it wasn't stated if Bass was in this photo as one of these soldiers. However, this was the photo from Buchenwald that is extremely symbolic and empowering. All right, so post-World War II. When the war ended, Bass's unit of the 183rd Combat Engineer Battalion was dismantled. He ended up in the Philippines for 8 months, as the war in the Pacific ended as well. Bass was 21 years old by the end of the war. He realized when he arrived back home after the war, the same environment was waiting for him that met his father back when he arrived from World War I. And that environment was segregation. In the Philippines, Bass became a company clerk and learned how to type and fill out payroll. He discovered that a young man, the exact same age he was, 21, did not know how to sign his own name. This motivated him to become a teacher, but that's if he went back to school, because he was still unsure at the time. However, after seeing that, he enrolled at Westchester State Teachers College upon returning to the United States. Bass wanted to become a gym teacher because he had a passion for fitness. However, his father encouraged him to be a history teacher. Bass also started analyzing and studying literature and poetry in college as well, just for the simple fact that his father had always placed a strong scent of poetry in his entire childhood. He had always quoted poets and famous literatures from history as well. So achievements. In the 1950s, Bass moved to a community operated by the Quakers where he bought a home. He became part of the civil rights movement as he was also teaching at an all-Black elementary school. At this school, the young kids looked up to Bass. Bass later studied at Temple University where he received a doctorate. He became a teacher and a role model to many students at Benjamin Franklin High School in Philadelphia. He later became a principal in 1981. So this is a very important slide. I titled it Two Leaders. So Bass and Wiseman came across one another and realized that they both knew one another somehow. So this man, Robbie Wiseman, is a Polish Jewish survivor of the Buchenwald concentration camp. He is an eyewitness to the destruction that occurred in Europe. Bass was one of the liberators who entered Buchenwald and provided the survivors with freedom. After the war, Wiseman immigrated to Canada and became an outreach speaker. Here we have a picture of Robbie Wiseman and Dr. Leon Bass. This is Wiseman when he was a young boy and Bass when he was a sergeant in the United States Army. And this is both of them as they went on to advocate for the Holocaust survivors and segregation. And then an interesting fact is that Robbie Wiseman, his childhood, he spent it moving from one concentration camp to another, and he ended up at Buchenwald towards the end of the war, and that is where he was able to meet Sergeant Bass. So background information. This is on the segregated units. So African Americans, they heavily served in positions throughout the Army as combat engineers, which Bass was, nurses, transportation corps, gunners, support units, and also in paratrooper units. At the time, the paratrooper units were the 82nd Airborne out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the 173rd Airborne, which is currently in Italy, and the 101st Airborne Division was a paratrooper unit back then. However, now they don't deal with airborne operations. They conduct air assault operations. And the 25th Infantry Airborne out of Alaska is one of those units as well. So some famous segregated units include the 332nd Fighter Group, which shot down 112 enemy planes while conducting 179 missions. Another one is the 761st Tank Battalion, which served in General Patton's Third Army, and the 688th Central Postal Directory Battalion, which was an only all-Black women's Army Corps to serve overseas in World War II. Here we have three wonderful photos provided by Google. First one is the 332nd Fighter Group, also known as the Tuskegee Airmen. This is the 761st Tank Battalion and the All-Women's Battalion, as I mentioned earlier. So here we have the 12th Armored Division, and this soldier right here was actually one of the only Black soldiers who was in a unit that wasn't segregated. And the US 12th Armored Division was one of the 10 US divisions during World War II that had integrated combat companies. And here we have a picture of some Nazi German soldiers who were surrendering. Yeah, so here is Second Lieutenant John Fox. This was an amazing video. However, as before, we won't be able to present it because it will not showcase.
Hi, sorry, somebody put in the chat that when you share your screen, there's a button that says share computer audio. So I don't know if you've done that, and she's saying you may have to unshare and reshare your screen, and then maybe we will be able to hear the sound. Somebody
Okay,
just put it on the chat.
Awesome, thank you, I appreciate it. I wasn't able to see that earlier because when I talk, I just ramble. Okay, so share your screen. There's a button that says share computer audio. Perfect. Okay. Just gonna go back on Zoom. All right, one moment, please.
Are you trying to exit the presentation?
Yes.
Try hitting exit.
Okay, I just don't want the other slides to quickly. Okay. No. Okay.
If you hover up around the top, yeah, or
One of these, right?
if you hover up around the top, you'll probably see the share screen thing drop down.
Okay. Perfect. Yes.
I just stopped it so this way you can share it again. And you're doing a great job. This happens to all of us.
Yeah, don't worry about it. It happens all the time to me too. Okay, found it. Share sound, and we are good to go, everybody. Sorry about that. That's my PT plan. I apologize. All right. So what I'm going to do is after the end of the presentation and after I present to you this video, I will go back to the other two videos and play it for you. Minimize this. And I'm going to press it and hear the first few words, and then I'm going to ask if you all could hear it, just to confirm.
Hello, everyone.
Are you all able to hear that?
Yeah.
Thank you to whoever sent that in the chat.
I am Dr. Keith Huxon, the Senior Director of Research and History here at the National World War II Museum. February is Black History Month, and today we'd like to talk a little bit about John Fox, Medal of Honor recipient. John Fox was born in 1915, raised in Ohio. He attended Wilberforce University, took a degree in engineering, and also attended ROTC. And in 1941, he was awarded a commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army, right on the eve of American entry into World War II. Now, John Fox joined the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, a segregated unit of African Americans fighting in Italy. Fox was assigned as a forward observer with the 598th Artillery Battalion with the 366th Infantry Regiment. They were fighting at Somma Colonia in Italy the day after Christmas, December the 26th, 1944. There was a group of Germans that vastly outnumbered the handful of Americans left behind in the village. Fox started directing artillery fire from the second floor of a house. As the Germans advanced, he called for fire closer to his position. It failed to stop the attack. He then radioed and called for fire to come down on his position. The radio message was unbelievable, but because they were desperate, The commanding officer said, "Fire it." And so, 3 days later, the Americans retook the village, and when they got there, they found John Fox remains amongst over 100 dead Germans surrounding him. Fox was nominated for an award, but amazingly, the recommendation was lost. In 1982, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, and in 1997, his award was upgraded to the Medal of Honor during the presidency of Bill Clinton. John Fox is one of 7 African American Medal of Honor recipients, and so today we honor him as part of Black History Month.
All right, perfect. I'm glad that was a success. Yeah, so Second Lieutenant John Fox was awarded the Medal of Honor, and the Medal of Honor is our nation's highest award given to a military service member for acts of gallantry in Call of Duty. All right, moving on. Story of Staff Sergeant Johnny Stevens. So Staff Sergeant Johnny Stevens is actually the uncle of Kean's president, Dr. Repollet. So Stevens joined the United States Army at the age of 22, becoming America's first ever Black tank commander. He served for 3 years, assigned to the segregated 761st Tank Battalion, as I mentioned earlier. And some of his awards include the Bronze Star Medal, the Oak Leaf Cluster, and the Purple Heart. The Purple Heart is an award given to a wounded service member. And also, here we have 3 photos. As you can see, the 761st Tank patch above his rank. And this photo in the middle is actually in 2006, Stevens was awarded the French Legion Honor. And that award is given, it's the highest award available and given to a non-French citizen. And here we have a survivor from the Holocaust, and it's Johnny Stevens. And we'll get into that. So in the photo, number 3, I wrote that down here, that is actually Max Eisen. He was a Holocaust survivor, and he wrote the book titled as By Chance Alone, a remarkable true story of courage and survival at Auschwitz. And Max Eisen once stated that, and I remember May 6th, 1945, I could hear there was some heavy equipment that was grinding. It was coming up the mountain. A tank came into the gates with 1 star on it. There were Black soldiers sitting on it, and they were in total shock from what they were looking at. And here we have our sources. That actually concludes the presentation. I'm going to go back and play the videos that I wanted to present earlier. Here's the first one.
Sergeant was there, and he told me to go one way when I went through the door, and he told my white friends to go another way, because my country promoted institutional racism, and the military was one of the largest to do just that. And so I went into an all-black unit, save for the officers. They were white, but all of my comrades in arms at that time were Black.
So it's a very powerful statement right there. And moving on to Liberating Buchenwald. Fast sharing.
And I looked
gradual thoughts
down into those eyes, and I realized that I could end up just like that. And that's when I began to question my wisdom for having joined the Army. And I wanted to know why I was there. What the heck am I doing here when I can't get a drink of water, when I can't ride on a bus, when I can't eat in a restaurant. And here I am putting my life on the line, fighting for rights and privileges that I'm denied.
Yeah, so going back off his why, he also mentioned in the testimony as well that after the war, when he was in college already, himself and a few college friends ended up stopping by a diner to grab a bite to eat. His friends all got food, however, Bass wanted just a glass of milk. And the waitress there, she refused to serve him, so she went to her manager there at the diner, and the diner told him that he could not be served. And Bass was distraught just for the simple fact that he's a war hero and he sacrificed his life many times for his country in what's highly considered the most deadliest war in the history of mankind. So that's something it's just insane to think that that would happen to someone who's sacrificed so much for a country that he's always loved, even though he's treated with such disrespect.
Well, thank you so much, Justin. And for those of you who joined during the presentation, so Justin is a sophomore at Kean University who is doing this as an internship. This is not for course credit. This is not required. This is because he himself is passionate about the topic. And I have to say, Justin, we all use Zoom every day now, and it never ceases to amaze me how no matter how many times you practice something, there is still something that goes wrong, and you were unflappable. You just kept going.
I appreciate
it. Thank you. And what I'd like to do is, perhaps provide an opportunity if anybody has, any questions, and then I can share a little bit more about the relationships between, Dr. Bass and Sergeant Stevens and the two Holocaust survivors that we saw photos with. So first, anyone have any questions? Please just speak up.
I actually do. Sorry, that's my son moving a chair around in the background because casual things to do. I have two. First, what was the last name of the survivor with Sergeant Johnny Stevens? Because I would really like to have that book.
That was Max Eisen. And send me a note and I will get you a copy of it.
Ooh, thank you. My other question was, did Bass ever come to a conclusion on why, when he was questioning himself, why am I doing this? Why, am I fighting for a country that disrespects me so much? It doesn't see me as equal. Did he ever come to any kind of conclusion that you came across?
Thank you for your question. From what I am aware of, after rewatching the testimony several times, he stated that he knew he was going to come back home to segregation, and as I showcased, he received an enormous amount of respect in France and England. However, he questioned his why, and as I showed in the video, he said, "What the heck am I doing here?" So I'm not sure if that answers your question. However, if I didn't answer it thoroughly, I will gladly reach back out to you.
No, you did great because, I think that perhaps, obviously, he didn't receive respect where he's from, in the United States. But I do wonder if, you described the compassionate relationships that he experienced in both France and England, if that was a major motivator to keep fighting, in
Of course, yeah.
opposition to segregation and to bias and unfair.
And I would also like to say as well that the principles that his father had instilled in him since a young age of patriotism, and his father actually made them pledge the anthem every morning, which is also crazy to think about coming from a man who also dealt with a lot of segregation during his time in the Army, both in the Army and back home as well. And his father still was an American patriot and still pledged on these principles to pass down to his children. So that's something that was very amazing to actually research and find.
Wonderful, thank you.
My pleasure.
I was wondering, it was mentioned in the last video that Johnny Stevens, he was supposed to get an award for his achievements, like after World War II, like the National World War II man said it. And he said that miraculously, the award was like never given to him until like, what did you say, like until the 1990s. And I'm wondering, was that because he was African American, that back in that time they were like, we're not going to give this award to someone who's African American?
Hey, so great question. You're also referring, you're actually referring to Second Lieutenant John Fox.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yes.
No, of course. So yeah, John, when I first saw that video and when I did some more research on him, I was actually shocked that it took them that long to give the man the Medal of Honor. I mean, because of his actions that he displayed while being under combat. And however, I didn't really find anything if it was lost because of his background of being African American. However, I would possibly assume that that could have been a major factor why they didn't rush the Medal of Honor or really rush into giving him an award. But at the same time, I will gladly look into that and get back to you as well.
Okay, thank you very much. By the way, the second video that we saw, what we were just, yeah, so the second video, is there a link to that? So maybe we can rewatch it?
Certainly, I will share the link to the testimony, which is accessible completely online.
Okay, thank you very much.
You are so welcome.
I just wanted to comment on, and I'm not really a history buff, but I didn't realize that the group initially that liberated Auschwitz was a Black battalion. I had no idea. And I feel like that is very overlooked because no mention of that ever. We just talk about Americans who helped free that camp. But I had no idea that it was an all Black battalion. So I think that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I actually have a family friend. His name is Ron Robinson. However, I call him Mr. Robinson just out of respect because he's been a friend of the family for years. And he works for JP Morgan. His brother served in the Air Force as a pilot. He was an officer, and I think he retired as a lieutenant colonel, if I'm not mistaken. However, Mr. Robinson's father served in the Army during World War II. I wasn't able, because when me and him text, we text strictly about baseball because he's a Mets fan and I'm a diehard Yankee fan. So that's all we talk about. However, I remember one day when I was sitting with him at a cigar shop and my father as well, he was telling me that his father, when he came back home from the war, he actually witnessed one of these camps. I'm not sure if it was Buchenwald or a different camp. However, it was definitely a concentration camp. And he said that when he got back, the taxi driver from the airport had asked him that, is it true of what's going on over there? And he said, oh, it's true, all right. And he told him what he saw, and the taxi driver called him a liar. And my friend, Mr. Robinson, stated that he stated in his Southern accent, my daddy never lied. So that's how I know he's telling the truth, because his dad as well instilled principles on both Mr. Robinson and his brother, who ended up becoming an officer in the Air Force. So. But yeah, going back to what you said, I've actually never really, like, someone who's a history freak as myself, especially when it comes to military history and the Army as well, I never would have realized that the segregated units played such a heavy role into the liberation of the survivors and to offering them a path of freedom.
Justin, perhaps you could share what you do on the side.
Yeah, of course. So I forgot to mention that. Thank you, Dr. Goldberg. Yeah, so I run a nonprofit organization. It's called Fallen of Heroes on Instagram. I have about 78.k followers, and I work with 20th Special Forces group with the Army, and also with Air Force Special Tactics, and not to mention the 2nd Ranger Battalion and the 3rd Ranger Battalion of the Army, which is the world's most lethal direct action unit. And we work together to honor the fallen warriors of the special operations community. So the special operations community, such as the Navy SEALs, the Army Green Berets, the Army Rangers, the Marine Raiders, the Air Force PJs, and the Air Force Combat Controllers and TACPs. So that's just my little side mission of just honoring those who fought to their last breath in defense to our Constitution, and as well as the red, white, and blue on our beautiful flag. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Justin. Not only for the work, of course, you did today, but for all of your hard work in raising awareness of American history, of the history of the Holocaust, and of really just inspiring what I hope is other students and history buffs to dig a little deeper and learn something new. And I'm very, very proud of what you've done. And perhaps like one parting thought from you is, why do you think leaders today in the military, in different services, should learn about this history?
I would say that, especially because I take some leadership classes at Seton Hall, because to be an officer, you need to be a leader of your soldiers. And of course, it's good to care about your personal career endeavors and achievements. However, you should always put your soldiers first in terms of the Army, because of course, the Marine officers will put their Marines first, Air Force, their airmen, and the Navy, their sailors. However, knowing your history is extremely important, just for the simple fact that not everyone in your unit comes from the same background, and not everyone is the same racial ethnicity as you. So it's always good to know the history of backgrounds per se, and that way you don't say something that could be offensive, or you're just a leader to your troops and you don't care about anything else, instead of making sure that they progress in their career and that they're exposed to great leadership and not toxic leadership, as we saw, as Bass mentioned, that the officers who were white, they treated them such as animals at times. That's instantly an example of toxic leadership.
And I think the more that we know, the better that we can do. We know that there's still institutionalized racism in this country. We know that there is no institution that is completely safe for any group of people. But I think by learning from the past, what you're doing is you're ensuring that the troops that you lead have a better grounding in history. They understand what was given by those who came before them, everything that was risked. And it's also a way of, again, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. You yourself did not experience the Holocaust. You were not an American soldier there. But what you can share is Dr. Bass's testimony. You can share that with your troops. You can share the bravery, of Stevens and Fox. And I think you're going to be an outstanding leader. And I'm glad that we had an opportunity to bear witness to your first public presentation right now. So thank you. And just as a sidebar, because it's a conversation Justin and I had, part of the reason I was so excited that Justin wanted to take this on is because I had the opportunity to work quite a bit and quite closely with both Robbie Waisman and Max Eisen, who are both Holocaust survivors who were still living in Canada. And I met Robbie Waisman in 2012. And before I knew anything about his experience, before I knew what he had gone through in the Holocaust, he said, "I need to tell you a story." And he told me all about his encounters with Leon Bass and how decades later, the two of them were reunited on a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation program, or CBC. And unfortunately, I was unable to get a digitized version to share with Justin. But the two of them were reunited in the 1980s. This was a major televised event, and they spent the next 2.5, 3 decades traveling the world together and speaking about their experiences as a Holocaust survivor and a witness to the Holocaust. And I think, their partnership, their friendship is so meaningful. And it's that important reminder that these were two men who came from vastly different upbringings. And yet they were able to come together and make a difference in the lives of so many people. And I will never forget this. I was the one who had to tell Robbie Wasteman when Leon Bass died. And we ended up having a really wonderful conversation about the meaning of friendship and about the meaning of being a change maker. So that's something I'm very proud of. And so when I came to Kean University and I discovered that we were the center that had this original, really Dr. Bass's earliest testimony that he gave about his eyewitnessing of the Holocaust, there was something that felt very beshert, like it felt it was meant to be. And in the case of Max Eisen, Max writes extensively in his memoir about the liberating officers from the American Army. And when we were doing research for Justin's presentation, I typed in Sergeant Johnny Stevens, and the first thing that popped up was a picture of him with Max. And again, it's another really important reminder that there are so many obstacles that we put up, and there's so many barriers. And if we need proof for one another, or we need proof for our students, or for ignorant community members of the fact that we can get along, and we can not only tolerate each other, but we can respect each other and build bridges. These are two stories I would really encourage people to look into. And if anyone would like a copy of Max Eisen's memoir, I'd be very happy to try and have that sent to you. So please just reach out to me. Anything you'd like to end off on, Justin?
Yeah, I was actually looking through my notes and I forgot to say this during my presentation. Specifically on the 8th slide, when I was talking about how they switched his MOS, his job, from infantry to engineer. I have here that when he stated that times only got worse, I said, keep in mind that many of the military training facilities were located in the South, and the bases operated with different medical staff, barracks, which barracks are the housing community for the soldiers or airmen or Marines or sailors. And they also had different hospitals for Black troops, and this is on a military base. So that's definitely something that is sad to hear, sad to see in research. I was like, wow, that's insane. But it goes to show you as well how the beauty of history is you study history not to recreate history, and that's more so to the bad parts of history, such as racism and even going back to the Holocaust as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for inspiring us and leaving us feeling good about the future of the next generation of leaders who are going to be steering us into the 21st century. So thank you, Justin. Wonderful job. And we're just very proud of you, and we look forward to seeing everybody again. And I will share a link to Dr. Bass's testimony in addition to some follow-up resources in the next couple of days. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.